You think addiction is your enemy, but what if it's God's way of waking you up? Carl Jung said that what destroys you most is, in fact, the path that calls you. And what you call addiction, alcohol, desire, control, approval, is just the unconscious's way of reminding you of the self you've abandoned. Addiction isn't about pleasure, it's about absence. It is the symptom of the soul that has stopped hearing its own call. You anesthetize yourself because you can't stand feeling. And not feeling is the new modern sin. Addiction is not the opposite of spirituality. It is the mirror of your separation from it. Every compulsion is an unconscious attempt to reconnect with the divine. But when the ego tries to heal the pain with pleasure, the soul begins to scream. And the more you try to escape, the more life haunts you with the same pattern, the same relapse, the same wound. You call it bad luck, but it's synchronicity, the unconscious trying to save you through repetition. You think you're trapped, but you're being summoned, because only those who descend into hell understand the value of heaven. God does not speak to those who feign purity. He speaks to those who bleed. The chosen ones are not those who never make mistakes. They are those who transform mistakes into conscience. And addiction, as dirty as it may seem, is the altar where many discover the truth about themselves. The pain you try to numb is the same pain that wants to free you. And if this tears you apart, if this sentence pierces you, it's because something inside you already knows. None of what you lost was punishment. It was purification. If you feel this message is for you, sign up now, because no one here will offer you comfort. Here, you will learn to hear God in the midst of collapse. You believe you're in control, but what you call a decision is actually a delayed response to something that's already happened within you. Carl Jung said that the conscious mind tries to hold back the ocean with a spoon, and that's exactly what you do when you try to control your life. The ego creates spreadsheets, goals, strategies, and defenses, believing everything can be predicted. But the unconscious observes silently, guiding the invisible strings that move your every step. You think you chose that relationship, that job, that breakdown. But it was the unconscious that pushed you into the mirror where you needed to see yourself. Control is the disguise of fear. It's the childish attempt to feel secure in a world that never promised security. And when you realize this, something inside begins to tremble, because everything that seemed solid reveals itself to be just an attempt to deny the mystery. You try to hold back the tide of life, like someone squeezing sand in their hands. The more you hold back, the more it escapes. Spirituality for Jung wasn't an escape from chaos. It was a surrender to the flow that the ego tries to dominate. You want guarantees because you're afraid to feel, and this fear is what keeps you stuck to the surface of your soul. Have you noticed how everything you try to control begins to rot? People, plans, even love itself. Attachment to control is a form of denial of the self, because the self doesn't need to guarantee anything. It simply observes, accepts, and acts when the time is right. Try letting go of control of something small today, a conversation, a routine, an expectation, and see what happens. Synchronicity begins precisely when the ego gives way. When the plan falls away, reality emerges. But the ego hates silence. It prefers the illusion of movement to facing the emptiness of not knowing. That's why you fill your time with distractions, opinions, certainties. Control is noise, and noise prevents you from hearing the unconscious whispering the way. Surrender isn't giving up, it's stopping fighting what's already happening. The fear of losing control is the fear of encountering your own shadow, that part of you that knows it was never in charge. That's why Jung said, until the unconscious becomes conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And that's when the illusion shatters. When you realize that control was never power, it was merely armor against the fear of the unpredictable. The same fear that shapes your entire prison. You call peace what is merely predictability. The rational mind feels alive when everything seems under control, when tomorrow has a script. But Jung saw this as the most sophisticated symptom of modern neurosis, the emotional dependence on certainty. You say you want freedom, but you fear the wind that brings it. You want stability, but it's this search that makes you sick. Certainty is the ego's sedative, the comfort of believing that nothing unexpected will undo you. But life, in its spiritual nature, doesn't respect your emotional blueprints. It pushes you toward uncertainty, because that's where the self resides, and the self doesn't grow in controlled soil. Every desire for guarantees is an attempt to avoid encountering the shadow, the chaos, the invisible that has been driving your story since before you were born. Predictability is the gilded prison of modern man. You observe people who live by algorithms, repetitions, and artificial security and call them balanced. But balance without soul is anesthesia. Jung said that the soul needs tension to create, and you, by trying to eliminate the unexpected, kill the creator within you. Want a practical example? Observe your day. How spontaneous is it, and how much is it programmed to avoid risks? How many times do you recalculate routes to avoid discomfort? Certainty weighs on you because it demands constant vigilance. It doesn't protect, it exhausts you. True spirituality begins when you realize that mystery is not an enemy, but a teacher. When the unexpected ceases to be a threat and becomes a teaching, fear becomes a portal. But the ego still tries to negotiate. It wants to feel the infinite, but with a guaranteed return. It wants to dive, but with a life buoy. And that's how you stay half alive, half awake. The price of certainty is the absence of synchronicity. Nothing magical happens in the comfort zone. Do you want to see the universe move? Submit a plan without knowing what comes next. Risk a conversation that exposes you. Do something that doesn't depend on applause or results. The psychological weight of certainty begins to dissolve when you accept dancing with the unpredictable. And it is at that moment that the unconscious approaches, offering what control never gave, meaning. But the ego still can't bear this lightness. It prefers to break, and it is in this collapse that the self begins to be born. There comes a time when control breaks, and with it, the image you've built of who you thought you were. Carl Jung called this symbolic collapse, when the ego can no longer sustain the pretense of stability. You call it a crisis, but it's birth. It's the soul tearing away the shell of the persona. Everything that crumbles, the relationship, the status, the plan, is just the self pushing the ego off its throne, and the ego screams because it believes it's dying. It mistakes surrender for defeat. But there's a stark difference. The ego bows to chaos to survive, while the self goes through chaos to be reborn. When everything you know fails, life can finally teach you. And it's at this point that true power begins to move. The one that comes not from will, but from surrender. You don't realize it, but what you call failure is the unconscious adjusting its coordinates. What you lost wasn't punishment, it was direction. When the ego breaks, the self manifests as a silent force, an instinct for reconstruction more authentic than any rational plan. This is when you begin to act differently, feel differently, choose differently, not because you've learned a lesson, but because something within you has shifted. This is the birth of the self, and it doesn't need to prove anything. Spirituality here isn't an escape from suffering. It's the gaze that recognizes meaning within it. When pain becomes language, collapse becomes a portal. Jung experienced this firsthand. He descended into the depths of the unconscious and returned transformed. You will too. But most retreat before reaching the bottom. The moment the ego breaks, something rare happens. Inner silence ceases to be a threat and becomes a refuge. The mind stops arguing with fate, and synchronicity begins to speak. People appear, doors open, life, which seemed like an enemy, begins to move with you. But the ego still tries to regain control, and it is in this impasse that the next stage arises. Because between what you were and what you are becoming, there is a space, a psychological space that the ego fears, but the self needs. It is the space of not knowing, the sacred ground where the new begins to germinate. You've been trained to believe that ignorance is weakness, that not knowing is synonymous with loss of control. But Jung saw the opposite. Not knowing is the womb of the unconscious, the space where the new is born. Most people live in too much of a hurry to allow the mystery to work. You want quick answers, immediate diagnoses, clear maps. You want to eliminate doubt before even hearing it. But the self communicates through uncertainty. It needs the empty space that the ego hates. Life doesn't speak in noise, it speaks in silence. And it is in this space that synchronicities align, that coincidences begin to dance as symbols, not as chance. Sustaining not knowing is a spiritual act of courage, because it is there that the rational mind dies and intuition awakens. This space is uncomfortable because it destroys what you used as a grounding. When the ego has no answers, it tries to fill the void with anything. Distraction, productivity, superficial spirituality. But the more you try to understand, the less you perceive. The unconscious doesn't reveal itself to those who try to analyze it, only to those who contemplate it. It's like trying to force a seed to germinate prematurely. There are times when the only wise action is to pause. If you want a real exercise, choose a situation in which you have no control, a relationship, a path, a doubt, and resist the urge to resolve it. Just observe. See the discomfort arise, feel your body react, and little by little realize that there is wisdom hidden in the silence itself. To remain in the unknown is like remaining between two worlds. The old has died, the new has not yet been born. Jung called this holding the tension of opposites, the cradle of transformation. It is in this field of tension that the self reorganizes the psyche, that the sacred wound begins to heal from the inside out. But the ego hates this interval. It seeks conclusions, not transitions. But the self is formed in the interval, not in the answer, and it is at this point that something greater begins to move. Because when you accept not knowing, life begins to show you what you have always known. And this silent movement prepares you for the next stage, the one in which the unknown ceases to be a threat and begins to reveal its hidden wisdom. You've been conditioned to fear the unknown as if it were the enemy of reason. But Jung saw otherwise. The unknown is the silent master of the unconscious, the field where spirituality manifests through synchronicity. The universe doesn't operate in linear logic. It moves in patterns, symbols, and repetitions. When you begin to observe, you realize that nothing happens by chance. That unexpected conversation, that book that falls off the shelf, that persistent dream, all are signs of the intelligence that inhabits the invisible. The problem is that the ego wants to transform mystery into method, transcendence into control. It wants to decipher the sacred with human tools. But the unknown is not to be dissected. It is to be experienced. And only when you enter it does the self begin to guide the steps the ego never dared to take. The hidden wisdom of the unknown isn't theoretical, it's sensory. It manifests itself in the intuition that sends shivers down your spine, in the coincidence that disarms, in the event that seems small but changes everything. When you open yourself to this, you begin to realize that the universe has a subtle pedagogy. It repeats lessons until you grasp them in your soul. This is why the same patterns return: relationships, failures, impulses. It's not bad luck. It's symbolic repetition. Life calls you again until you awaken. Want a practical exercise? Observe the small coincidences today, the people who cross your path, the phrases that repeat themselves, the signs that appear when you decide to let go of control. This is the unconscious trying to talk to you, and the more you listen, the clearer everything becomes. The unknown is not chaos, it is the hidden manual of the soul. It only seems like disorder because you still read with the eyes of the ego. Jung said that when the self is awakened, even chance obeys inner harmony. What changes is not the world, it is perception. When your gaze aligns with the mystery, fear transforms into reverence. And it is at this point that you realize the unknown never wanted to destroy you, it wanted to rebuild you. Life has always been a mirror of your inner state, and when you change, it changes with you. But there is something that still blocks this harmony, the fear of looking within. Because as long as there is unintegrated shadow, the unknown will continue to seem like a threat, and it is this inevitable encounter that awaits you in the next step. The need for reassurance is the most disguised form of fear. You call it planning, precaution, maturity. But Jung saw it as the shadow's desire for integration, the unconscious fear of being swallowed by the unpredictable. The rational mind says, I need to know what will happen. But the soul responds, you just need to be present. This tension is the battleground between ego and self. The ego wants predictability because it can't stand the feeling of vulnerability. It believes that if it controls everything, it won't feel pain. But this attempt at anesthesia is precisely what makes it sick, because control doesn't protect, it separates. Reassurance is the wall the ego builds to keep from feeling the flow of life. But what it calls security, the self calls a prison. You notice this when you repeat patterns that seem safe, but only reproduce the same emptiness. You choose predictable people, familiar paths, ideas that spare you discomfort, and then you call it stability. But the stability of the ego is the stagnation of the soul. Jung said that when the unconscious is ignored, it manifests itself in symptoms, anxiety, insomnia, loss of meaning. These are the shadow's cries trying to be heard. Want a practical example? Notice when your need for certainty intensifies. Perhaps it's before an important decision, a new relationship, a change. This is the signal. There's something repressed, demanding space. And if you deny it, fate will do it for you. With falls, breakups, losses, the shadow always finds a way to emerge. Healing begins when you face the fear of having no guarantees, when you understand that the unexpected is not punishment, it's initiation. It's the self inviting the ego to walk through the fire of uncertainty and discover that there's something within you that doesn't need control to exist. When the ego gives in, the body breathes. Anxiety transforms into presence. The shadow becomes an ally, not an enemy. But it's at this point that the paradox intensifies, because between wanting to know and accepting not knowing, something begins to emerge. A bridge between the human and the divine, between the conscious and the unconscious. Jung called this the transcendent function, the power to create syntheses between opposites, and it's precisely to this portal that you're being led now. Between I want to know and I don't know, there's a point the ego doesn't understand, but the self recognizes. Jung called this the transcendent function, the moment when the psyche, tired of fighting itself, begins to build bridges between opposites. It's when reason and intuition, control and surrender, fear and faith stop canceling each other out and begin to converse. This internal dialogue is the birth of the third path, the one that doesn't choose sides, but transcends both. When you sustain the tension between what you are and what you want to be, something within you reorganizes. It's like alchemical gold, born from the friction between fire and matter. Suffering is not punishment. It's the process of purifying the soul as it attempts to give birth to a new consciousness. The transcendent function is not a theoretical concept. It is a living experience. It manifests in those moments when you feel like you're about to break, but instead of giving in to escape, you decide to remain present. This is when chaos and order coexist within you, and for a moment, everything seems bearable. It is in this state that the self begins to guide the ego, not through obedience, but through integration. A real-life example? Think of those moments when you feel anger and compassion at the same time, fear and courage, pain and gratitude. This contradiction is the portal. If you observe it without running away, the unconscious begins to reveal meanings that were previously hidden. Conflict becomes creation. Duality becomes harmony. The sacred wound becomes a channel of wisdom. The transcendent function is the point at which spirituality ceases to be belief and becomes experience. You no longer believe, you feel. You don't talk about surrender, you surrender. This is true birth, the self emerging as a consciousness that accepts life without needing to understand it. And when this happens, something changes in your outlook. You stop searching for the right path and begin to realize that the path is made as you walk. The third path is not destiny, it is movement. It is the synchronicity between what you feel and what the universe responds to. But the ego, even wounded, still tries to resist. And it is when it releases the last thread of control that the soul can finally dance with the mystery. When the ego lets go of the steering wheel, the soul dances again. It is at this point that life ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a flow, the self in harmony with the unknown. Jung said that suffering arises from resistance to what is. You suffer not because life is uncertain, but because you try to force it to be predictable. When surrender occurs, something within you realigns with its own nature. Coincidences multiply again. Encounters gain purpose. Time seems to conspire. It is synchronicity restoring communication between you and the universe. This is what dancing with mystery is, not knowing the next step and yet trusting the rhythm. The self doesn't need a map, it feels the music. Dancing with mystery is accepting that spirituality is not an escape from pain, but communion with it. The ego seeks light, but the self learns from the shadows. It understands that transcendence is not escape, it is integration. It is looking at the sacred wound and realizing that wisdom springs from it. When you allow yourself to dance, you realize that even the stumbles are part of the choreography. The mistake, the loss, the delay, everything fits into an invisible pattern that the rational mind could never understand. The ego wants choreography, the self wants surrender. Want a practical example? Instead of reacting to everything, observe what moves you. When something gets out of control, don't correct it. Listen, perhaps the chaos is teaching you the next step. The return to the dance with mystery is the reconnection with the sacred, not the sacredness of beliefs, but that of lived experience. It is the moment when the I and life cease to be opposites. The self becomes the dancer and the music at the same time. It is in this state that fear loses its function and trust becomes instinct. You stop asking why and begin to feel what for. But this fertile silence that arises after surrender still holds a secret. Because when certainties die, what follows is not immediate light, it is silence. A silence so profound that the ego, accustomed to noise, believes it to be empty. But it is in this silence that the invisible begins to speak. After certainties crumble, silence comes. Not the external silence, but the one that dwells within, where the ego, tired of trying to understand, finally falls silent. Jung saw this moment as the fertile ground of the soul, the place where the unconscious begins to whisper what was previously muffled by the rush to know. It is in this silence that the self begins to speak. But the ego, accustomed to noise, feels fear. It calls emptiness what is merely space. It tries to fill it with distractions, noises, quick spiritualities, promises of instant meaning. But the self doesn't shout, it murmurs. And if you don't slow down, you'll never hear. Silence isn't the absence of answers, it's the language of the invisible. This silence carries a different weight. It's in it that you realize that nothing external can fill what's missing. Spirituality ceases to be a search and becomes a listening experience. Synchronicities, once subtle, begin to intensify, as if the universe has finally found a clear frequency to communicate. It's common for you to feel discomfort at this point, a kind of heightened loneliness. But it's just the soul reorganizing itself. The ego craves noise because noise is anesthesia. But the self flourishes in silence because it's in silence that truth emerges, stripped of embellishments. If you want to practice, try spending a day without consuming anything that distracts you. No music, no social media, no conversation. See what happens. The initial discomfort is the portal opening. In silence, you begin to see the invisible, not with your eyes, but with your feelings. This is when time slows down and the world seems clearer, more alive, more symbolic. You realize that everything has always been speaking to you. The wind, the pauses, the losses, the body. The self communicates in poetic language, and silence is the translator. Jung said that this state is the prelude to transcendence, because the soul, now cleansed of noise, is ready to hear the music of the flow. And the flow is God in motion. But the ego still resists surrendering fully. It still seeks some guarantee, some certainty that the next step will be safe. And it is precisely this last illusion that must die for the flow to be born. Living without guarantees is the most spiritual gesture there is. It's when the ego, finally exhausted from trying to predict the unpredictable, surrenders to the rhythm of the self. Jung said that the meaning of life is not in eliminating chaos, but in dancing with it. This is what flow is, the moment you stop controlling and begin to cooperate. It's not passivity, it's active trust. It's acting without demanding results. It's walking without obsession with destiny. The self doesn't make plans. It responds to life. And it's in this state that synchronicity intensifies. Coincidences become compasses, signs become language. Life begins to conspire in your favor, not because you control it, but because you allow it. Flow doesn't obey force, it responds to surrender. Living without guarantees is recognizing that every attempt to predict is fear in disguise. It's accepting that spirituality doesn't protect you from pain, but teaches you to navigate it with presence. It's trusting the invisible, even when the invisible seems silent. This is the point of maturity of the soul, when love ceases to be a necessity, control ceases to be a defense, and the future ceases to be a threat. Jung said that the self is the point of balance between the human and the divine, the place where the I and the mystery coexist. When you live in flux, you discover that destiny isn't a straight line, it's a spiral, and each turn that seems repetitive is actually a deepening. You don't regress, you refine. But living this way requires faith without guarantees, a faith without the promise of comfort, without a final reward. It is the trust born not of results, but of attunement. Flow is transcendence in motion, the union between what you feel and what the universe manifests. It is the return to your inner home, the place where control dies and the sacred begins. Jung knew, whoever embraces uncertainty rediscovers God within themselves. The ego will call it madness, the world will call it irresponsibility, but the soul will call it freedom. And it is at this point that the journey returns to the beginning. Because mystery never ends, it renews itself in silence. And perhaps it is in this silence that the next revelation begins to whisper. Maybe what you call addiction was never a mistake, but a language the soul used to call you back. Because every time you try to run away from the pain, it's the pain that chases you. And every time you try to control the impulse grows, not to punish you, but to show you where there is still shadow. Carl Jung said that the psyche is self-sufficient in its healing process, and that the unconscious takes you precisely to the abyss that can transform you. You think you're losing control, but you're being driven inward. The collapse is not the end, it is the gateway. Addiction is the disguise of calling, God's most brutal way of saying, "You have forgotten me." And maybe deep down, all you were looking for in drugs, in people, in pleasure, was presence. The presence he lost when he started hating himself. Spirituality doesn't begin when you give up addiction. It begins when you look at it with compassion and say, "I understand why you were born." Because nothing inside you is the enemy, only unheard parts. And when you finally listen, something changes. Relapse becomes a right, emptiness becomes a portal, guilt becomes strength. The ego wants to heal itself, but the self wants to know itself. And addiction is just the mirror where this encounter begins. So now tell me, how many more times will you run away from yourself before you understand that it is precisely your pain that carries the map of your liberation? How many times will you numb yourself so you don't feel the call that's screaming in the silence? What if what you call a fall is actually the beginning of your rise? What if what you call addiction is just a disguise for your most sincere prayer? God doesn't speak with words. He speaks with symptoms, coincidences, and breakdowns. And maybe this video didn't appear by chance. Maybe this pain has a name, a time, and a purpose. And maybe now, finally, you're ready to listen. If this got through to you, if some sentence cut you inside, sign up now. Because that was just the first cut.